Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to be discussing the principles of mercantilism and how they affected the growth of transatlantic trade and policies regarding European nations and their North American colonies. So, let's kick it off. Here are our main objectives for today, so take a minute and pause and note. And now we'll dive into our narrative. So, as you hopefully remember, the Spanish conquered a massive colonial continental empire in the Americas and also had got some territories in Asia, which you hopefully remember from world history. They imported massive amounts of wealth, but the Spanish spent their colonial largesse on a variety of different expensive boondoggles, namely a fleet of ships to invade England that ended up sunk off the coast of Ireland. And they, on all the silver that they brought in, led to massive amounts of inflation, which led to the eventual bankruptcy of the Spanish government, as they never really effectively increased their tax rate to match the rising prices. And so the Spanish Empire provided an example of how not to rule your society through mercantilist principles, because the other thing that they spent all their money on was expensive continental wars of religion in Europe. And so the King of Spain / the Holy Roman Emperor spent crazy amounts of money trying to force people in, what is today Germany to be Protestant or to be Catholic. And this led to the eventual bankruptcy and the collapse of Spain's power in the Americas and also in Europe. So the Spanish built a colonial empire off mercantilism and lost it for some of the same reasons. Eventually, of course, the Spanish Empire would split and the Spanish Habsburgs would simply take over Spain, but the monarchy would never recover, and Spain is never going to be again an important player on the world stage, and they're more or less going to fade into the background. So let's put a pin in Spain, and we'll talk about them again briefly when the Spanish colonies become independent, and then again when the United States stomps on them at the turn of the 20th century. So, what is a mercantilist system? We talked about this briefly when we were talking about the Spanish colonial system, so hopefully you already remember the basics, but it's a system in which the goal is to accumulate as much gold as possible through creating a favorable balance of trade in a closed network trade system. You attempt to force your colonies to send raw materials to you, which you then manufacture into finished goods and sell back to your colonies or other places. By this, colonies or mother countries guarantee a profit while keeping their colonies economically underdeveloped and subservient to the mother country. This was the basic world philosophy, and that everyone tried to keep trade with their colonies exclusive. And it led to significant amounts of tension for what I hope to you are obvious reasons. The main philosopher who came up with this idea is a guy named Thomas Munn, and so it's pretty straightforward. Quote, "For much treasure will be brought in or carried out of a commonwealth as foreign trade do over or under balance in value, and this must come to pass a necessity beyond all resistance, so that all other courses which tend not to this end, however they may seem to be fruitful, are in the end hurtful, because they are like two violent floods which bear down their banks and suddenly remain dry again for want of waters." So other trade might seem lucrative at first, but what if you make too much money? And then, of course, it'll disrupt the economy and everything will be a disaster. And so this incredibly well-reasoned argument was used to establish these mercantilist empires for several hundred years. So how do you ensure that the colony or colonies trade only with you? A couple different reasons. A couple different ways. One, of course, is you mandate a favorable balance of trade through laws in order to ensure that you get all of the money, or you get all of the money accumulated in your treasury. So you set up laws banning your country from trading with anyone else, or like Spain did, you just import massive amounts of silver and then theoretically manage it better than Spain did. Or as we talked about before, it's this system of raw materials for finished goods. The other way so instead of banning all trade, sometimes countries would also place tariffs on trade, which make foreign products more expensive and therefore make the finished products manufactured in the home country more profitable. So, for example, here, as you can see in this graphic, if Americans wanted to protect their cloth from British-made manufacturers, they could place a 25% tariff, making British cloth more expensive, therefore pushing consumers to produce American-made cloth. The British passed a series of laws called the Navigation Acts in 1650. This is under the Protectorate to attempt to make sure the colonies only traded with England. They were somewhat loosely enforced because they forced, similar to when we talked about the Spanish colonies and mercantilism, they forced the colonies to trade only with England, and all goods had to be shipped to England to be shipped back to the colonies, which was massively inefficient. And the colonies had been developing somewhat by themselves, without much influence from England since their founding, because the English had been busy, fighting civil wars over monarchical power and religion. And so when these mercantilist acts passed, the colonists were less than pleased. Especially because, in general, mercantilism benefits only the mother country and provides very few benefits for the colonies beyond access to manufactured goods, which they'd probably have anyway, and a market for their raw materials, which they'd probably have anyway. Great Britain really gets no negatives from mercantilism, and so obviously was very invested in attempting to continue these mercantilist practices. But for the colonies, there's really nothing in it for them. And so something like the Sugar and Molasses Act is passed, which attempts to put enforcement onto some of these mercantilist policies and attempts to punish people who are smuggling. The end result is, instead, the smugglers just pay bribes in order to avoid the molasses tax. And so despite the fact that the molasses tax was relatively low, smugglers became accustomed to simply paying a 2.5-cent bribe as opposed to paying the 5-cent molasses tax. A series of other regulations are also passed. The Woolens Act is pretty straightforward. The Hat Act, again, straightforward. And Molasses Act attempted to force people to buy British molasses, but in general, bribery and smuggling happened almost daily. Quote, "Another captain boasted that he had evaded the law by writing 2 manifests of his cargo, one of which contained the contraband goods he had on board, and the other, those goods were left out. He then went to the customs house and stuck the true manifest in his sleeve of that hand which he was to hold up by swearing, and delivered the false manifest to the officer, and swore the manifest to be the true one, meaning the one that was in his sleeve. Very tricky." Or, quote, "It was a matter of astonishment to observe what little care was taken to enforce the laws. The breaches openly committed against the act of trade and the shameful prostitution of office which prevailed in most ports on the continent could not escape the notice of the most superficial observer." Because customs officials were often poorly paid, they would supplement their meager income with bribes from merchants, and it was completely acceptable to anyone except the people passing the laws in England that these bribes would be given regularly, and all of these taxes were to be avoided. Smuggling was rampant, especially smuggling of molasses, which, as we talked about in the New England lecture, was being distilled into valuable rum. French molasses, especially from the very valuable French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, was cheaper than British molasses, and so it became entirely commonplace for colonists to smuggle in cheaper French molasses in order to significantly increase their revenue from rum production. And the British did some attempts to crack down on smuggling, but in the end, it's super expensive to have your military vessels or even your Coast Guard spend a lot of time chasing around fast colonial merchant ships in order to recoup a couple £100 in lost customs revenue. This did lead to war. These mercantilist restrictions and all of this smuggling led to warfare over a period of time. There are a series of Anglo-Dutch wars happening concurrently with the English Civil War. Then there's a Franco-Dutch war, and then there's a third Anglo-Dutch war, and then there's a war of Spanish succession that also involves the colonists. And so it's pretty frequent for warfare to happen here. These wars often also contain a colonial component, where they sort of exist as proxy wars like the Beaver War, where French and British forces and their allied Native American forces face off. But because no major territory changes hands, we're not going to go into tons of detail on them and just say in general they were expensive. The only real takeaway is that they failed to enforce most of these policies. After the war, someone would pay a small indemnity and then the status quo antebellum would be reestablished. And it involved the English seizing New York from the Dutch in the Second Anglo-Dutch War. So I guess that's an effect you can note. There was a little bit of territory that was gained from Spain in the War of Jenkins' Ear, which again you probably don't need to know about. And the English got some territory up in Canada by Newfoundland, but in reality, most of these mercantilist wars were expensive naval wars that accomplished really very little. So, with all of this money spent on mercantilist warfare and all of the distractions that the British have been going through with the Restoration and then the Glorious Revolution and all of the unrest in England, the general policy became one of what's called salutary neglect. Trade with the colonies was making so much money, even with all of the smuggling and avoiding taxes, that the British basically decided that it wasn't worth trying to enforce it. They didn't want to pay their customs officials enough to make them honest. They didn't want to pay enough Coast Guard ships to effectively patrol the colonial coast. And they didn't want to try to really have to enforce or put colonial smugglers through the legal process, because colonial courts tended to be incredibly lenient to smugglers on account of how dependent they were on smuggled goods. And so salutary neglect became the status quo from 1650 all the way up until 1750. It was assumed that colonists would not have to pay any of these taxes and that they could avoid them with simple bribes. The other effect of all of this is it's the golden age of piracy, and so pirates operated within this system, attacking especially illegal smuggled ships, because the smugglers, of course, could not call on the protection of the British Navy lest they be arrested for smuggling. And so we get guys like Edward Teach, Blackbeard, the pirate, who after stealing gentleman John Bonnet's flagship, ends up raiding up and down the coast of Virginia, attacking smuggled ships, until eventually he's killed in a battle after getting stranded along a river along the Carolina coast. So pirates fit into this network as well. It's exciting stuff, and it's one of the dangers of smuggling. But again, smuggling was so lucrative that it continued despite the threat of both British and pirate attacks. So that brings us to our objectives for the day. Hopefully you can answer these in some detail. And when we come back tomorrow, we'll talk about the development of the Enlightenment and the religious backlash known as the Great Awakening. Thank you for listening.